Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to kick off our presentation today with the theme Ruling the Countryside. In this session, we'll explore the fascinating history, key figures, and strategies that shaped rural leadership. So stay with me as we uncover how the countryside was governed and its significance in our broader history. Let's get started. Let's take a look at the contents of this presentation. We start with the introduction, setting the stage for what's to come. Then we move into the company's revenue, giving us an idea of the financial aspects involved. Next, we explore the features of the permanent settlement, which was a major land revenue system implemented in India. We also delve into the ryotwary system, another key land revenue arrangement. In the middle, we'll discuss the occasion of granting the Diwani right, which was a significant turning point for the company's control over revenue. We'll examine the revenue settlements employed by the company, and then look at the problems faced under the permanent settlement. A map of the world showing woad cultivation will give us geographical context. We'll also cover the situation that was not entirely smooth, highlighting issues and challenges. The slide titled, "If your answer is blue, you are correct," hints at the importance of indigo, especially the blue dye. We'll then look at the Blue Rebellion and its aftermath, understanding the causes and consequences of this uprising. Moving forward, we'll explore why there was such a high demand for Indian indigo and the problems associated with niche cultivation. The map of India from 1765 and 1805 will help us see the territorial changes during this period. We'll examine the old zamindari system and the mahalwari system, along with their provisions. Crops grown for Europe will be discussed, as well as how indigo was produced and cultivated. We'll analyze Britain's turning interest toward India and the ryotwary system, including its advantages and problems. We'll look at the question of whether the government supported the Indigo Rebellion and whether it was justified. Finally, we'll see how the problems with the ryotwary system affected the farmers, and how the overall themes of revenue, agriculture, and rebellion are interconnected in this historical context. Now, let's talk about the significance of the Battle of Buxar. With this victory, the East India Company essentially completed its annexation of Bengal. It was a major turning point because, prior to this, they relied on puppet Nawabs to control the region. But the company's real goal was to become the Nawab of Bengal itself. Why? Because they wanted to hold the power directly, especially the financial power, which was crucial for their ambitions. To achieve this, the company introduced several economic measures. These included new revenue settlements designed to increase their income. The idea was to have a steady flow of revenue that could be used for military expenses, keeping their forces strong, and also for buying goods to export back to Britain. So, essentially, these steps were part of a broader plan to strengthen the company's economic and military position in India, and to turn Bengal into a major source of wealth for Britain. This move marked a significant shift from mere trade to direct control and exploitation of resources, which played a key role in the overall expansion of British power in India. Now, let's delve into the occasion of granting the Diwani right. This was a significant event in the history of governance and administration. Essentially, the granting of the Diwani right marked a turning point because it gave the British East India Company the authority to collect revenue directly from the territories. This was not just about taxation. It symbolized a shift in political power and control. It was granted at a specific time when the British were consolidating their influence in India, and establishing this right allowed them to strengthen their administrative grip. So, understanding the occasion helps us see how this right was more than just a legal privilege. It was a strategic move that played a crucial role in shaping the future of British rule in the region. This ties into the larger theme of how colonial powers established authority and expanded their control through key legal and administrative milestones. Let's take a closer look at the maps of India from 1765 and 1805. These maps are crucial because they visually show how the territorial boundaries and regional control changed over those 4 decades. You can see how the Mughal Empire's influence shrank significantly, giving way to the expanding powers of the British East India Company and other regional entities. In 1765, India was still largely fragmented, with many independent kingdoms and principalities. But by 1805, we notice a clear pattern of territorial consolidation under British influence, especially in the eastern and southern parts. This shift highlights the growing dominance of British power and sets the stage for the colonial rule that would follow. Connecting this to our overall theme, these maps illustrate the gradual but steady process of colonization and the loss of political independence for many Indian regions. They help us understand how territorial control evolved, which is key to grasping the broader story of India's transformation during this period. On this slide, we see a pivotal moment in the company's history. The Treaty of Allahabad was signed on August 12, 1765, between Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II and the British East India Company, represented by Robert Clive. This treaty marked a significant shift because it officially made the company the Diwan of Bengal. Now, what does that mean exactly? Well, as Diwan, the company gained the right to collect revenue, essentially, taxes, from the provinces of Bengal, Orissa, and Bihar. This wasn't just about taxation. It also meant that the company became the chief financial administrator in these regions. They were responsible for managing land and organizing the revenue collection process, all with the goal of maximizing profits to cover their increasing expenses. Think of it as giving them control over the financial flow of a vast area. And importantly, this arrangement allowed the company to operate quite freely. They could buy what they needed and sell what they wanted, essentially controlling trade and economic activity within these territories. So this treaty fundamentally transformed the company from a trading entity into a governing power, setting the stage for their expanding influence in India. It's a crucial turning point that links directly to the overall theme of colonial expansion and economic control. Let's take a closer look at the company's revenue during this period. The company primarily operated as a trader, but it also acquired Diwani rights, which gave it some administrative authority over revenue collection. Interestingly, the company wasn't very focused on establishing a consistent system for assessing its income. Instead, its main goal was to increase revenue in order to buy cotton and silk at lower prices. Before 1765, the company relied on importing gold and silver from England to purchase goods. But after that, the revenue collected from Bengal itself started to finance these purchases, which marked a significant shift. However, this system had serious social consequences. Artisans and farmers were forced to sell their goods and produce at cheaper prices, leading many to abandon their villages and traditional livelihoods. This decline in artisanal and agricultural production was devastating, and perhaps the most tragic outcome was the famine of 1770, which resulted in the death of around 10 million people. So overall, this slide highlights how the company's focus on revenue and trade, combined with its policies, had profound economic and human impacts, tying into the larger theme of colonial economic exploitation and its consequences. Now, let's take a look at this vibrant scene of a weekly market in Murshidabad, located in Bengal. These markets, known as hats, were incredibly important in the local economy. Peasants and artisans from nearby rural areas would come here regularly, usually once a week, to sell the goods they produced. Whether it was rice, spices, textiles, or handcrafted items, these markets provided a vital space for exchanging goods. At the same time, people would come to buy what they needed for daily life: food, cloth, tools, and other essentials. These weekly gatherings weren't just about commerce. They were also social events where communities connected and exchanged news. This scene highlights the importance of local markets in supporting rural livelihoods and facilitating trade. It also underscores how these markets were key nodes in the broader economic landscape of Bengal, helping to sustain local economies and connect rural producers with urban consumers. Throughout this presentation, we see how such markets played a crucial role in the economic and social fabric of the region. Now, let's take a closer look at the different revenue settlement systems that the company employed to meet its revenue goals. First, we have the old zamindari system. This was one of the earliest methods, where zamindars or landlords collected revenue from the peasants and paid a fixed amount to the government. It was quite hierarchical and often led to issues like exploitation and lack of efficiency. Next, we move on to the mahilwari system. Under this system, revenue was assessed collectively from a village or a group of villages, known as a mahal. The entire village was responsible for paying the revenue, which aimed to promote a sense of community responsibility and accountability. Then there's the permanent system, which is closely linked to the mahilwari approach. It introduced fixed revenue assessments that didn't change year to year, providing stability for both the government and the landholders. This system helped in establishing a more predictable revenue flow. Finally, we have the ryotwary system. This system was quite different because it directly assessed revenue from individual cultivators or ryots, without intermediaries like zamindars. It aimed to give farmers more direct responsibility and reduce exploitation, although it also faced challenges in implementation. Overall, these different systems reflect how the company adapted its revenue collection methods over time, balancing efficiency, fairness, and stability, key themes that run through the entire presentation. Let's take a closer look at the old zamindari system during Warren Hastings' tenure. As you can see in the table, the structure involved three main groups: the company, the zamindars, and the peasants. During this period, no major changes were made to the revenue system. Hastings essentially continued with the existing Mughal-era zamindari system. This was a revenue settlement, which means it was an agreement or arrangement made between the British East India Company and the zamindars. The key role of the zamindar was to collect revenue from the peasants, those who actually worked the land, and then pay a fixed amount to the company. This system placed a significant burden on the peasants, as they had to meet the demands of the zamindars, who in turn were responsible for forwarding the revenue to the colonial administration. Understanding this system is crucial because it laid the foundation for how land revenue was managed during colonial rule, and it also highlights the hierarchical nature of land ownership and revenue collection at that time. This system set the stage for later reforms and changes, but in Warren Hastings' time, it remained largely unchanged from the Mughal model. Let's take a closer look at this concept map of the old zamindari system. As you can see, at the top we have the East India Company, which played a significant role in shaping the system's structure. The East India Company was essentially the colonial authority responsible for managing territories and revenue collection. Beneath that, we have the zamindars, who were local landlords. They acted as intermediaries between the colonial rulers and the peasants. Their role was crucial because they collected taxes from the peasants and then paid a portion to the colonial administration. Now, connecting directly to the peasants, who are at the bottom of this hierarchy, these were the actual agricultural workers or farmers. They were responsible for producing the crops and, in turn, paying taxes to the zamindars. This map highlights how the old zamindari system created a layered structure, where the colonial power, the zamindars, and the peasants each had distinct roles. It's important to understand that this system often led to exploitation of the peasants, as the zamindars had significant control over their lives and livelihoods. So, in the broader context of our discussion, this concept map helps us visualize how colonial policies and local hierarchies intertwined, shaping rural society and economy during that period. Let's take a moment to understand why there was a need to improve agriculture during this period. In 1793, Governor-General Lord Cornwallis introduced the concept of permanent settlement. This was essentially a new way of managing land revenue. It was a formal agreement between the East India Company and local landholders, known as zamindars, who were often rajas or talukdars. The idea was to create a stable system where the zamindars would collect taxes from the farmers and pay a fixed revenue to the government. However, despite its intentions, this system had significant implications for agriculture. It often led to neglect of land improvement and agricultural productivity because the zamindars' main focus was on collecting revenue rather than fostering better farming practices. This highlights the importance of understanding the need to improve agriculture, which was crucial for the economic stability of the region and for the well-being of farmers. Connecting this to our overall theme, it shows how colonial policies directly impacted agricultural development and the livelihoods of those dependent on farming. Let's take a closer look at the features of the permanent settlement. Under this system, local rulers like Rajas and Talukdars were recognized officially as zamindars. This was a crucial change because it gave them a formal status in the revenue collection system. These zamindars were then responsible for collecting revenue from the peasants in their areas on behalf of the company. One of the key aspects was that the amount they had to pay was fixed permanently. This means that once the amount was set, it couldn't be increased in the future, regardless of changes in productivity or circumstances. The idea behind this was to create stability, so zamindars knew exactly what they owed and could plan accordingly. This system aimed to ensure a steady, predictable flow of income for the government. And, interestingly, it was also designed to motivate zamindars to invest in improving their land, since they knew their revenue commitments wouldn't increase unexpectedly. Overall, this feature was about creating a stable, predictable revenue system while encouraging land improvement and investment. Let's take a closer look at this concept map of the permanent settlement. At the center, we have the East India Company, which played a crucial role in establishing this system. The map shows how the company interacted with different groups, primarily the zamindars and the peasants. The zamindars were landowners who collected taxes from the peasants, who actually worked the land. This system was designed to create a fixed revenue demand, meaning the tax amount was set permanently. The idea was that the zamindars would be responsible for collecting and paying taxes to the company, which aimed to make revenue collection more efficient. However, this also meant that the peasants faced a new relationship with the zamindars, often leading to increased exploitation. Overall, this map helps us understand how the British aimed to organize land revenue, but it also highlights the social and economic impacts on those directly involved, especially the peasants, who bore the brunt of these changes. It connects to the broader theme of how colonial policies reshaped traditional systems and affected local society. Let's talk about some of the key issues with the permanent settlement. First, zamindars, or landowners, were not really motivated to invest in improving the land because their focus was mainly on collecting revenue. The revenue amount was fixed and often set too high, which created problems. If they couldn't pay this fixed revenue, they lost their zamindari rights altogether. Now, when market prices went up, zamindars could earn more income from their land. But interestingly, the company didn't see any benefit from these increased prices. This disconnect meant that the company's revenue remained fixed, regardless of market fluctuations. For the cultivators, this system was quite oppressive. They often had to borrow money just to pay the fixed revenue, which made their lives difficult and added to their burdens. Overall, these issues highlight the rigidity and unfairness of the permanent settlement, which aimed for stability, but ended up creating many hardships for both zamindars and cultivators alike. Today, let's take a closer look at the Mahawari system. This system of revenue collection was devised by an Englishman named Holt Mackenzie in 1822. It was introduced specifically in the northwestern provinces of the Bengal Presidency. The Mahawari system marked a significant shift in land revenue administration. Unlike earlier systems, it involved collecting revenue from entire villages or groups of villages, which were called mahal. This meant that the revenue was assessed based on the collective productivity of the village as a whole, rather than individual landholdings. The idea was to create a more community-based approach, encouraging cooperation among villagers. It also aimed to make revenue collection more efficient and fair. Understanding this system helps us see how colonial policies evolved to manage land and resources. It's an important chapter in the history of land revenue systems in India, connecting to the broader theme of colonial administration and its impact on Indian society. Let's take a closer look at the provisions of the Mahawari system. Essentially, this was a settlement between the company and the local community, which was called the mahal. Now, A mahal could be a single village or a group of villages coming together. The key here is the role of the headmen of these mahal, who formed what was known as the body of co-sharers. This body was responsible for collecting revenue from the peasants and then paying it to the company. An important point to note is that the revenue collected wasn't fixed. It could increase in the future, giving the company some flexibility to demand more if needed. The body of co-sharers also held ownership of the land, which bonded the community and the company in this arrangement. Now, if a peasant failed to pay the revenue, the land could be taken over by the mahal and redistributed to another peasant. This system ensured the land remained productive and revenue was collected efficiently. Additionally, the mahal was tasked with creating new agricultural land and allotting it to peasants, promoting agricultural expansion. Overall, this system aimed to create a collective responsibility for revenue collection, tying the land and community together. But it also gave the company the potential to increase revenue and control over land. Let's take a closer look at this concept map of the Mahalwari system. At the center, we have the East India Company, which played a pivotal role in shaping land revenue policies during this period. Surrounding that, we see the body of co-shares, known as the Mahal. This refers to a specific revenue unit or estate, which was divided among co-sharers or co-owners. Now, within this system, we also see the peasants. They are the primary cultivators working the land within the mahal. Their relationship with the co-sharers and the East India Company is crucial because it influences how revenue was collected and managed. This map helps us visualize how the Mahalwari system was structured, showing the interconnected roles of the East India Company, the co-sharers, and the peasants. It's important because it highlights the complex land administration and revenue collection mechanisms introduced during colonial rule. Understanding this map gives us a clearer picture of the administrative and social dynamics that shaped rural India under British policies, linking directly to our broader discussion on colonial land systems and their impact. Let's talk about the Ryotwari system, which was a significant shift in revenue settlement in South India. This system was introduced as a new way of collecting revenue directly from the cultivators, known as ryots. After the war with Tipu Sultan, Captain Alexander Reed started implementing this system on a small scale, and it was later developed further by Thomas Munro. Munro played a crucial role in extending this system across all of South India. One of the key ideas behind the Ryotwari system was that revenue assessments should be made directly with the farmers who had been tilling the land for generations. This meant that instead of dealing with intermediaries or zamindars, the British aimed to establish a direct relationship with the cultivators. To do this effectively, careful land surveys were conducted to assess the land properly before setting the revenue. Thomas Munro also believed that the British government should act more like paternal protectors, ensuring the rights of the ryots were safeguarded. This approach was quite different from previous systems and aligned with the broader theme of reforming revenue collection to be fairer and more direct. Overall, the Ryotwari system represented an effort to create a more equitable and transparent process, directly linking revenue to the actual landholders, which was a fundamental change in land revenue policy in South India. Let's take a closer look at this concept map of the Ryotwari system. At the center, we see the East India Company, which played a major role in shaping agricultural and revenue policies during that period. One of the key points here is that there was no middleman involved. This means that the system was designed to directly connect the peasants with the revenue collection process. This direct connection is significant because it affected how revenue was extracted and how the peasants experienced this system. Instead of going through intermediaries, the peasants had to deal directly with the authorities, which often increased their burden. The term peasants here is crucial as well. They were the primary producers of agricultural goods, and under this system, they were responsible for paying revenue directly to the government or the East India Company. Understanding this map helps us see how the Ryotwari system was structured to streamline revenue collection, but also how it impacted the peasants' lives and their relationship with the colonial authorities. It highlights a key aspect of colonial administration, reducing middlemen to simplify processes, but often at the expense of the local farmers. So at this point, it's clear that not everything was going smoothly. In fact, none of the revenue settlements turned out to be favorable. The revenue rates that were fixed or collected were actually very high, which created a lot of problems. Peasants found it increasingly difficult to pay these taxes, and as a result, many of them started fleeing the countryside altogether. The officials had this vision that new systems would transform peasants into wealthy, enterprising farmers, but that didn't really happen. Instead, the harsh revenue demands pushed people away and failed to produce the prosperity that was hoped for. This highlights how the policies, instead of fostering growth, actually led to unrest and migration, which is a crucial part of understanding the broader challenges faced during this period. On this slide, we're looking at the crops that Britain focused on cultivating in Europe, specifically through their influence in India. You see, for the British countryside, India wasn't just a source of revenue, it also became a place where they grew the crops they needed. By the late 18th century, the cultivation of opium and indigo was expanding significantly. These crops were crucial for trade and profits. But it wasn't just about those two. The British also forced farmers to grow other important crops such as jute in Bengal, which was vital for making ropes and sacks. In Assam, tea cultivation grew rapidly, eventually turning into a major industry. In the United Provinces, now known as UP, sugarcane was grown extensively, supporting the sugar industry back home. Punjab became a key region for wheat and cotton, with wheat supporting food supplies and cotton fueling textile industries. And in Madras, rice cultivation was pushed to meet both local and export demands. The British used a variety of methods to expand the cultivation of these crops. This included changing land policies, introducing new farming techniques, and sometimes even forcing farmers to grow certain crops instead of others. All of these efforts were aimed at ensuring that India produced the specific crops that Britain needed for their economic interests. Overall, this slide highlights how colonial powers strategically shaped agricultural practices in India to serve their economic goals, which had a profound impact on local farmers and regional economies. Let's take a closer look at these two images and think about the dominant colors in each. First, we have a kalamkari print from 20th century India, specifically from Andhra Pradesh. Kalamkari is known for its intricate designs and vibrant colors, often featuring earthy tones like browns, reds, and deep blacks. When you look at this print, notice which color stands out the most and draws your eye. Next, we have a Morris cotton print from late 19th century England. William Morris was famous for his nature-inspired patterns and use of softer, more muted colors. In this case, you might see a lot of greens, creams, and perhaps some subtle reds or blues. The key point here is to observe how the dominant color in each piece reflects the cultural context and the time period. The Indian kalamkari's bold, earthy tones contrast with the more subdued palette of the Morris print. This difference highlights how color choices are influenced by regional aesthetics, available materials, and cultural symbolism. So, when we compare these two images, think about how the dominant color not only affects the visual impact, but also connects to the broader themes of tradition, identity, and artistic expression that we've been exploring throughout this presentation. Let's take a closer look at indigo crop. This is a fascinating example of how innovation is transforming agriculture. Indigo crop is focused on developing sustainable solutions for crop management, leveraging technology to improve yields and reduce environmental impact. They emphasize the importance of data-driven decision-making, which helps farmers optimize their practices. This ties into our overall theme of integrating technology to create more efficient and eco-friendly farming. By adopting these new approaches, indigo crop is contributing to a more resilient and sustainable agricultural system for the future. If your answer is blue, you are correct. Now, when we talk about the color blue, it's often called indigo. But did you know that indigo is actually produced from a plant called indigo? This plant has been cultivated for centuries, especially in India. Historically, India was the world's biggest supplier of indigo during the colonial period. This highlights how important natural sources like indigo were to global trade and industry. So, understanding the origins of this color connects directly to our overall theme of exploring how natural resources have shaped cultural and economic history. So, why was there such a high demand for Indian indigo? Well, the indigo plant mainly grows in tropical regions, which made it a valuable and somewhat scarce resource. By the 13th century, Indian indigo was already making its way into European markets, especially among cloth manufacturers in Italy, France, and Britain, who used it to dye their fabrics. Now, even though some Indian indigo did reach Europe, it was quite expensive. That high cost meant European dyers often relied on a different plant called woad, which they grew locally in northern Italy, southern France, and parts of Germany and Britain. Woad could produce blue and violet hues, but it wasn't quite the same as indigo in richness. Interestingly, the producers of woad actually pushed their governments to ban the import of Indian indigo, aiming to protect their own markets. But despite these efforts, cloth dyers still preferred indigo because of its deep, vibrant blue color. This desire for high-quality dye highlights a key theme in our overall discussion: how trade and technological preferences shaped the demand for particular commodities, like indigo, and influenced economic and political decisions across regions. Let's take a closer look at this map of the world showing woad cultivation. As you can see, woad has historically been grown in specific regions, mainly in Europe, particularly in parts of the UK, France, and surrounding areas. These regions were ideal due to the climate and soil conditions suitable for woad cultivation. The map highlights where woad was most prominent, which is important because it connects to how the plant was cultivated for centuries as a vital source of indigo dye. Understanding the geographical spread helps us appreciate the cultural and economic significance of woad in different societies. It also shows us how this crop was localized, yet had a far-reaching impact through trade and dye production. This visual reinforces the overall theme of the presentation: how a simple plant like woad played a crucial role in trade, industry, and even social identity throughout history. By examining this map, we gain a clearer picture of the historical landscape of woad cultivation and its importance in shaping economic and cultural exchanges across regions. So, let's talk about why there was such a huge demand for Indian indigo. The main reason was the pressure to lift the ban on Indian indigo production, which led producers to start cultivating indigo in their colonies instead. For example, in France, they grew indigo in Saint-Domingue, which is now Haiti, in the Caribbean islands. Portugal began cultivating indigo in Brazil, while England expanded its plantations in Jamaica. Spain also set up indigo plantations in Venezuela. Additionally, you'll find that indigo plantations started appearing in North America too. Now, with the rise of industrialization in England, the demand for indigo skyrocketed. Cloth dyers, who needed a reliable and vibrant dye, looked urgently towards Indian indigo as a solution. This increasing demand was driven by the growing textile industry and the need for high-quality dye sources. All these developments highlight how interconnected colonial production and European industrial needs were. The demand for Indian indigo wasn't just about tradition or preference. It was about meeting the needs of a rapidly expanding industry, and this demand played a key role in shaping colonial agricultural practices and global trade patterns. So, as the demand for indigo grew, the British looked to India as a key source for this valuable crop. They saw great potential in expanding indigo cultivation there. Starting from the late 18th century, we see a rapid increase in indigo farming in Bengal, which soon dominated the global market. In fact, by 1788, about 30% of the indigo imported into Britain was coming from India. And just a couple of decades later, by 1810, that number had skyrocketed to 95%. This shows how crucial India had become for indigo supply. The high-income prospects from indigo cultivation attracted many Scottish and English entrepreneurs to India. They came with the intention of setting up production and capitalizing on this booming market. This shift highlights how economic opportunities influenced British involvement in India during this period. tying into the larger theme of colonial economic exploitation and resource extraction. Now, let's explore how indigo was cultivated. There were mainly two methods used, nidge and ryote. The nidge method involved a more traditional approach, where local farmers would grow indigo in small patches, often as part of their subsistence farming. It was labor-intensive but allowed for careful management of the crop. On the other hand, the ryote system was more commercial and involved tenant farmers who cultivated indigo on behalf of a landlord or a merchant. This method often led to large-scale plantations, emphasizing efficiency and higher yields. Both methods played a significant role in the history of indigo cultivation, reflecting different social and economic dynamics. Understanding these methods helps us appreciate the complexities behind indigo's role in trade and colonial economies. Let's take a closer look at the nidge system, which was a specific way of organizing indigo cultivation. In this system, the planter had direct control over the land where the indigo was grown. This means they owned or rented the land, giving them the authority to manage the entire process. The planter would either buy or rent the land from others, and then produce indigo on that land. To do this effectively, they employed hired laborers to carry out the cultivation and harvesting. This system highlights the importance of land control and labor management in the indigo industry, and it played a significant role in how indigo was produced and supplied. It also connects to the broader themes of plantation economy and agricultural organization that we've been discussing in this presentation. Overall, the nidge system was a key method used for indigo cultivation during this period. Let's talk about some of the problems faced with nij cultivation. One major issue was the lack of fertile land. Planters simply couldn't find large enough areas in compact blocks to grow indigo on a plantation scale. They often tried to lease land from others, but this frequently led to conflicts over land use and rights. Mobilizing labor and organizing bullock carts also proved to be quite challenging. The timing was particularly tricky because labor was most needed during the peak rice cultivation season for peasants, so finding workers for indigo farming without disrupting rice fields was a real difficulty. These challenges highlight how logistical and resource constraints hampered the expansion of indigo cultivation under nij. Now let's look at the ryote system. Under this system, planters would compel peasants, known as ryots, to sign a contract called a sada, which is essentially an agreement. Interestingly, the village headmen often had to sign these contracts on behalf of the ryots. Those who did sign would receive a cash advance from the planters at a low interest rate, specifically to grow indigo. However, this loan came with a condition. The ryots were committed to growing indigo on about 25% of their landholding. The planters would provide the seeds and the drilling equipment, but it was up to the ryots to prepare the soil, sow the seeds, and take care of the crop. This system tied the peasants closely to the planters, often leading to a cycle of dependency and debt. It highlights how colonial economic policies aimed to control local agriculture while benefiting the planters at the expense of the ryots. Now, let's look at some of the problems with the ryote system. Once the indigo was harvested, the ryots, or peasant farmers, were given a new loan to continue their work. However, many of them felt this system was quite harsh because it created a never-ending cycle of debt. They often received very low prices for their indigo, which made it difficult to improve their livelihoods. Additionally, the planters tended to choose the best soil for cultivating indigo, even if the land was originally suitable for rice. This meant that after harvesting indigo, the land would lose its fertility and could no longer be used for rice cultivation. This cycle of land degradation and debt highlights some of the unfair practices faced by the ryots under this system, connecting to the larger theme of economic exploitation during colonial times. So, moving on to the Blue Rebellion and what happened afterward, what we see is that the peasants, who were fed up with the oppressive ryote system, decided to take a stand. They basically refused to accept loans anymore, which was a huge challenge to the planters' control. This resistance sparked clashes starting in March 1859, when the peasants refused to grow indigo, leading to direct confrontations. As this rebellion grew, the peasants didn't just stop at refusing to cultivate indigo. They also refused to pay rent and even attacked indigo factories. And what's remarkable is that they fought back with a variety of weapons: swords, spears, arrows, bows, and even women joined in using kitchen implements as weapons. The boycott was effective, and planters faced widespread resistance. They were beaten up, and their influence waned. Even gamastas, the agents who often managed these plantations, were targeted. In many areas, village headmen and zamindars, who were also unhappy with the planters' dominance, mobilized the peasants and fought pitched battles with armed groups, called lathiels. This whole episode highlights how deeply the peasants' anger and frustration ran, and it shows how this rebellion was a turning point. It was not just about resisting indigo cultivation, but also about challenging the entire oppressive system that was built around it. This rebellion connects to the larger theme of resistance against colonial economic exploitation and their fight for autonomy. Let's talk about whether the government supported the Indigo Rebellion. After the 1857 revolt, the British government was quite worried about the possibility of another large-scale uprising. In 1859, the lieutenant governor personally toured the districts troubled by indigo cultivation, which many saw as a sign of sympathy towards the indigo growers. Magistrate Ashley Eden even issued a notice stating that riots, those who farmed the land, would not be forced into accepting indigo contracts anymore. At the same time, intellectuals from Calcutta visited these indigo districts and started writing about the terrible conditions faced by the riots under the indigo system. Their reports drew attention to the exploitation and suffering of the farmers. In response, the government set up the Indigo Commission, which held the planters responsible for the abuses and advised the riots to refuse future contracts. This period was a turning point because, after the rebellion, indigo production in Bengal dropped sharply and moved to Bihar. However, the industry faced new challenges later, especially with the discovery of synthetic dyes in the late 19th century, which severely impacted indigo exports. Fast forward to 1917, when Mahatma Gandhi visited Champaner in Bihar. He saw firsthand the plight of the indigo cultivators and demanded that the government take action to address their hardships. So, in summary, while there were some government actions that seemed sympathetic, the overall support was limited, and the plight of the indigo farmers continued to be a serious issue. This connects to the larger theme of exploitation and resistance during colonial rule, showing how indigenous struggles persisted despite official responses.